We have been doing a series in Jonah, and we're sort of jumping into the middle of a totally different book, a letter in the New Testament, so it's a little bit disorienting. I don't want to go too much into the broader context of this letter, but I do want to do a little bit, otherwise we'll feel a little bit lost. But we're in New Testament times now. We're not in the Old Testament with Jonah. We're after the events of the gospel, of the coming of Jesus Christ, his life, his ministry, his death, his resurrection. And now we have a man named Paul, the Apostle Paul, who's writing a letter. This is a letter to a church in the city of Corinth in the Roman Empire of the first century. And Paul was what you call an apostle, which sounds like this grand title, but basically an apostle is a sent one. You know, we get postal service. That post language is the same language behind apostle, someone who is sent, just like letters are sent, or someone carries a letter or information. Paul is someone that Jesus had sent with the message of the gospel to begin communities of Jesus followers and believers throughout the Roman Empire of the time in the major cities. So one of these cities was Corinth, and he's writing to them. This was a community that already existed, and he's writing to them, and in this context especially, well, the letter he's writing mostly to correct them and to chastise them and to confront them, because they're off in many, many ways. They're off in their the way that they relate to one another, the way that they evaluate good leadership, what makes a good leader. They're off in their sexual habits and morals and behaviors. But one of the ways in which they're off, which is really the emphasis here, one of the ways in which they're sort of fallen out of alignment with the principles of Jesus Christ, the gospel, is that the way that they're doing worship, so the way that they're getting together and singing and hearing the word of God and serving one another in principle, the way that they're doing worship has gone really off the rails. It's become very self-serving, so everyone comes together, and the emphasis is, what do I get out of this experience, and how do I meet with other people so that I benefit? That's been sort of the emphasis that's happened. And so there's a mess in this church as a result of this. Things are not right. And so he's writing to them, and he spends several chapters dealing with this. We're only looking at a tiny snippet that is important, but it's key. Because notice that in verse 31, hopefully you have your Bibles open or a Bible app open, in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 31, Paul begins by speaking of the priority of God's glory. Okay? The priority, the putting as number one in all of what is the Christian life, and in this case worship, as God's glory. And look what he says. He says that the priority of God's glory is for all of life. By the way, hopefully again, as I always say, you have your sermon notes, and that can help you follow along and bring some order to the chaos that is sometimes my sermons. But notice, Paul begins this little section with, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do. In other words, that's the way of saying, in everything that you do, like even when you sit down and eat at McDonald's with a buddy, right? Or you're just eating with your friends, or everything, school, work, traveling, thinking, everything that you're doing, all of life, simple and complicated, private and public, all that you do it for the glory of God, okay? For God's glory. That sounds really great. That sounds really spiritual, doesn't it? What in the world does that mean? Right, if we're honest. What does that mean? Okay? Let's try to unpack that a little bit. We don't have time to get into the topic of the glory of God because it's one of the biggest topics in all of the Bible, and we could spend hours. We're going to not do that justice, but there was a Dutch theologian about 100 or so years ago named Herman Bavinck, and he describes it as this. It's the perfection of God, okay? That kind of perfect essence of God, the perfection of God, which is inwardly the ground of his blessedness. In other words, he is good and great because he is so perfect in every way. Outwardly, as it were, it carries his glory with it. The biblical words communicate the idea of heavy, weighty, significant. Refer to a person who is weighty or heavy or significant, right? And some of the words used in the Bible have the idea of a splendid appearance of one whose name is known far and wide, okay? Splendor and beauty. So there's a lot there. It's a multifaceted diamond, right? There's the idea of God's greatness and his splendor, his beauty, his reputation, okay? His power, His majesty. It's all that at the same time, okay? It's sort of like the accumulation of all that makes God, God. It's like the godness of God is the glory of God. So obviously we should be aware that this concept is way beyond anything that we can understand. I mean, the closest thing I can think of to convey a little snippet of this idea might be thinking of the coronation. So most of us, maybe not all of us, but most of us have never witnessed the coronation of a king. But in a few months, in principle, we will see on TV, on HD, the coronation of King Charles, right? And what's interesting is a big part of that is, I mean, he's already the king, right? But this ceremony symbolizes, through a series of rituals and physical objects and things, the fact that he is king, okay? And one of the key points, obviously, is the crown, right? It's his coronation. He gets to put on a crown, or a crown is put on his head. And think about a crown for a second. I mean, even if we've never seen a real-life actual coronation, we've all seen the Disney movies, and we've seen the Lord of the Rings, and we've seen all this stuff, and we have a picture in our head of what a coronation might look like and what a crown looks like, right? And think about that. It's this thing that you put on your head. It's gold. It's got diamonds, you know, and it symbolizes the idea of the glory of the king, right? So it symbolizes, you know, it has the idea of it's made of gold in theory, or usually they're made of gold, and gold is heavy. So there's a heaviness. It speaks of the weight of their power, the weight of their authority, and with it the burden of the responsibility of their power and authority. You know, we often say something like, "Oh, heavy is the crown," right? You know, and we use that metaphorically, like someone who has the burden of having to carry a lot of responsibility, right? That's symbolized there. But the other thing about a crown is that it's beautiful. It's sort of radiant. There are diamonds and etchings on it, and so it is both beautiful to look at, but also denotes the idea of the weightiness of the office, in this case, of the king. That's kind of the idea behind the idea of God's glory. Okay, so fine, that's God's glory. What does it mean to live unto the glory of God? Okay, what does it mean to live for God's glory? And I think biblically it's something like this. It's living in such a way that reflects in our life, even in a small way, the greatness, beauty, and awesomeness and weightiness of God, right? In other words, we live in a way that acknowledges that for us, God really has this splendor to him, right? This weightiness to him. You know, there are some people who walk into a room and it's just like, yeah, there's Sam. That's great. And there's other people who walk into a room and it's just like the atmosphere changes. Like, it doesn't matter where you are, it does not matter where you are on the political spectrum. If Ron DeSantis or Joe Biden, so two different parts of the spectrum, either one of them walk into the room, doesn't matter how you vote, it's different than if Sam walks into the room, right? Or Joe Smith walks into the room. It just is different. Well, is there blood, a different type of blood? Is it? No, they carry an office that implies authority and power that just changes everything. So what does it mean to live in light of the fact that your whole life is lived in front of God, who has way more power and authority than Joe Biden or Vladimir Putin or whoever, right? That's kind of the idea, right? It's living in a way in which you communicate, you believe this is real, and it changes everything about how I make decisions, how I live, what I love, what I like, what I don't like, and so on and so forth, okay? Living in such a way that everyone looks at you and goes, oh, he really believes that God is this great, okay? Okay, so, all right, that's a simple point. Paul is saying, whatever you do, okay, whether you go fishing, whether you eat, whether you're working, whatever you're doing, do it to the glory of God. Okay. Then he switches to the priority. So he's talked about the priority of the glory of God. And from there, he connects this to the priority of serving others, which it doesn't seem like those two things are connected, but we'll look at this. Look at this. Verses 32 and 33, okay? He says, please everyone, okay? So think about this. The gospel, the message of Jesus, of the cross and the resurrection of Jesus, is going out into the Roman Empire, right? They worship all these gods. They have all these religions, okay? And all these people groups. So we have Jews, Samaritans, Greeks, Macedonians, Romans, And as they hear the message, many of them are coming together into communities like this. And you've got some Jews, and you've got some Greeks, and you've got some Macedonians, and they're coming together. Gentiles, that is non-Jews, and Jews. And what they have in common, almost the only thing they have in common, is that they all believe that Jesus really is the Savior of the world, really is God. He really did die for their sins. In almost every other way, all their values, all their culture, all their worldview, all their habits and customs are all different. And they're all being crammed together into new communities and trying to figure out how do we coexist together, okay? I think most of you know this, maybe not all of you know this, that before being in Cornerstone, I was a pastor of an international church in Santiago, Chile. And so it was an English-speaking church in a majority Spanish-speaking country. So most of the people who went to the church were people from other countries. We had obviously people from the United States, South Africa, Australia, but we also had a lot of people from the Philippines. We had people from South Korea. We had people from Indonesia, and on and on and on. And so it was funny, as you got to meet people, you went up to greet someone. I would come, in Chile we're used to, you greet people by kissing them on the cheek. It's nothing weird, there's nothing awkward or uncomfortable about it. You greet, especially women with women and men with women, just a quick kiss on the cheek. So sometimes you would go and give someone a kiss on the cheek and they'd be like, what is happening here? What's going on with the pastor? What's he trying? So you realize, oh my goodness, I've offended them, so I can't kiss on the cheek. So someone else would walk in and you'd be like, hello? And they'd be like, man, why is the pastor so cold and distant and doesn't want to, what have I offended? Because you're trying to live with these cultures that are, now that's a silly example, it's just to say how you say hi, but just extrapolate, that's everything. What you eat, how you cook, what do you think about this and this person, authorities, decision making. So think about how hard, because that's what most of the churches of the first century, that's what they were like. They were very international, very cosmopolitan communities, because the Roman Empire just had everyone mixing up and crossing borders, and it was a very kind of free-flowing place. You famously had the highways that just connected, basically Britain all the way out to, the Middle East. And so they're all trying to figure out how to live in this situation. So what does Paul say in verse 32? He says, in all this, give no offense to the Jews or to the Greeks. When he says the Greeks, it's just a way of saying everyone who's not a Jew in this case, okay? Give no offense to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God. Go out of your way to not offend others, okay? Don't unnecessarily offend others, and be attentive to the fact that this person's Greek and this person is Jew, and so on and so forth. Now, some people read this and go, okay, so Paul wants all of us to be people pleasers, to just be people who are always concerned with making everyone else feel happy and good, right? That's not what Paul is saying, okay? What he's saying is, go out of your way to not offend people for the sake of salvation, for the sake of the gospel. Okay, look at verse 33. He says, do not offend anyone. Go out of your way not to be offensive, just as I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of many, that they, the many, might be saved. Okay? He's saying, do not make people uncomfortable by stressing and emphasizing in your life and your behavior and the way that you talk things that are not of first gospel importance. Okay? In other words, he's saying, for example, to the Christian, maybe the Gentile Christian, okay, the non-Jewish Christian. He's saying, if you invite a Jewish person to your house, then don't serve pork. Not all of you get that, but the Jewish faith, you're not supposed to eat pork, okay? Don't serve pork. And Paul's saying, I get that there's nothing wrong with eating pork. You can eat pork to your heart's content, but don't serve pork if you're inviting a Jewish family to have a lunch, right? Because some people would say, well, I'm free. I'm free to eat pork. I'm in the new covenant. We're no longer under the law of Moses, so I should be free to do whatever I want. That is the mentality of so much of the West. Me, my freedom. I should be free to do what I want, and if someone else is offended by that, that's their problem. Paul says that's not the lifestyle of the Christian. The lifestyle of the Christian is don't use your freedom to do whatever you want to serve your interests. Use your freedom to serve the interest of others. So you're free to eat pork, but use that freedom if you invite a Jewish family to lunch to not eat pork and don't offend them. Because pork or non-pork is not the gospel. It is a secondary implication of the gospel. There will be a moment if that Jewish family become believers in Jesus that they'll have to learn that, hey, now you can eat pork, pork's no big deal. But it's not a front-end issue. Like, our concern is not to get them to change their eating habits and then see if they'll turn to Jesus. Like, everything is backward in that process. Now, we can think that's obvious, but how many of us are interested in getting people to, for example, change their politics before they become Christians? Or change their backgrounds before they become Christians? Or to resolve all the sins and problems in their life and then become Christians? Well, but you don't understand, they're doing this thing. Yeah, they're doing this thing which is not right. But the first priority is that they meet Jesus. That we facilitate the road for them to meet Jesus. That we make it straightforward and easy for them to encounter Jesus when unbelievers come into our presence. Paul even says, later in chapter 14, he says, if someone who is an unbeliever comes into your midst and you're speaking in languages that they don't understand, they'll think you're crazy. So make sure that when they come in, what's happening in the service is understood. Well, no, the thing is, I want to teach on the doctrine of the supralapsarian decrees of God. That's great, and there's maybe a place to teach that. But if you're going to communicate or teach something like that, maybe use language in terms that this person who's coming in can understand. Because what's the point of them coming in and hearing all, maybe even the right doctrine? Like, that's not, but you're using language that they'll never grasp, and they're confused. For example, okay, that's just an analogy from what Paul says in chapter 14. So Paul is very, very radical. For him, the gospel is a first priority. Now, I want to be very clear. It's very clear for Paul and everything else. If the gospel itself offends someone, that's their problem. So we don't change the gospel. We're not talking about changing the gospel or accommodating the gospel itself to make it more palatable. That's not what we're saying. But there are so many things around the gospel and around the center of the Christian message and life that we can make the number one priority, or we can make the center, or we can make of first importance, and confuse people who don't know Christ, turn them off, turn them away. And so Paul says we make the gospel number one, and we make it a priority. It's very interesting. I've always been really impressed by something that Tim Keller once said. Tim Keller is a pastor of our denomination, the PCA denomination in New York City. Planted a church, very large church, multi-site church in Manhattan. But I once heard him say that if he was someone who had just moved into Manhattan and wasn't a pastor, he was just someone who moved into Manhattan, he would never go to his own church. In other words, he would never go to Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York City. It's not the music style that he likes. It's not the liturgical style that he likes. It's not the, if he was making a priority, what is good for me, what I like, what's my style of music, what's my style of liturgy, what's my style of preaching, he's like, I wouldn't want to go to my church. I would want to go to another church. But he said when they planted the church, they didn't think about, let's build a church that we like, that's for us, that's our style. They planted a church for the sake of the city, for the sake of those who inhabited Manhattan. They didn't compromise the gospel, but service style, dress style, music style, length of the service, type of preaching, we want the gospel to be clear to Manhattanites. And we need to preach the gospel in such a way that we can bridge the cultural divide, the worldview divide between the time and history of the New Testament and the Bible and 20th century, 21st century New Yorkers. And so I think a lot that is offended, and that's bothered a lot of people, like Keller said that. But I think what he's trying to do is he's trying to apply what Paul's saying here. And the last thing I will say, so we've talked about the priority of the glory of God, the priority of putting others first, of serving others. And I'll end with this, the priority of imitating Christ in chapter 11, verse 1. I think as we close, one thing I think that can happen is we can read this and go, God, I understand Paul's concern with bending over backwards to not unnecessarily offend people so that he can preach the gospel so that they can know Jesus. But Paul's an apostle, right? He's an officially sent emissary of Jesus. And so for apostles, or if you will, for missionaries, perhaps church planters, that's something that they need to do. That's what the great evangelists or great leaders need to do. But this is not a message for me, or this is not a message for the church body or the church community. This is something that Paul did, right? That's what we could say. But if that's what you're tempted to say, this is something that Paul did that we don't need to do, Paul checkmates us. He says checkmate with this verse. Because look at what happens in chapter 11, verse 1. Remember, the Bible, it's not like Paul was writing the letter to the Corinthians and said, okay, so here's chapter 1, verse 1. He's just writing a letter. He wrote a letter, and later editors added chapter numbers and verse numbers. Those are great. But we have to read the flow of thought continually, right? So listen to the verse. So let's start at verse 32. Give no offense to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God, just as I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of many, that they may be saved. Be imitators of me. That's the problem with, well, that's Paul's call, not my call. Or that's what missionaries do, not we have to do. Is that Paul writes to a church, he says, in this thing that I do, where I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of many that they may be saved, in all of that, imitate me. You do that too. You do what I'm doing. It's funny because I remember the first time I read that phrase, I thought that was so arrogant. Imitate me. Like, how can he say imitate you? Like, does anyone feel like they can comfortably go up to someone and be like, Roland, just imitate me? Like, if you want to grow in your Christian life, just watch me, and you'll get the other way. Like, that's... The problem is Roland might be willing to do it. Don't do it, Roland. Man, that's uncomfortable, right? That feels like Paul is being really arrogant. But Paul is not saying, I'm such a great Christian in every way that just watch what I'll do and you'll be fine. That's not what Paul's saying. If we read the phrase by itself, because that's what happens sometimes when we just start chapter 11, verse 1, and we read it, it kind of shocks us. But in the context, what he's saying is, imitate me in what? In that I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of many that they may be saved. In that, imitate me. In other words, in that emphasis, that I put the well-being of others over myself, and I don't advantage myself, I seek to be for the advantage of others, in that, imitate me. That's what he's saying. In that behavior, in that model, in that pattern, imitate me. But listen to what he's saying. He says, as I give no offense to anyone, Jew or Gentile or the church of God, as I don't seek my advantage, but that of many, that I might save some, do this, imitate me, because what? As I am of Christ, because I am imitating Christ, is the point. Imitate me as I imitate Christ. Now think about it. We read this in other letters of Paul. We read, Philippians 2. Jesus Christ, second person of the Trinity, God himself, in glory. He could have lived unto his own advantage. Worshipped and adored by angels. These puny humans on earth have rebelled against me. Just grab my finger and smush them all, right? Judgment upon all mankind. And he would have been absolutely right in doing so. Maybe he could have said something like what God said to Moses, I'll start again. But that's not what Jesus did. That's not what God does in the Bible, right? We just heard, your goodness is coming after me. God comes after us. And how does it look like in the Bible? Ultimately, it looks, you see it over and over again in the Old Testament, but finally, what God does is He comes down into the earth. That's what Christmas is about, the incarnation. God comes into this world and into this story and takes on human flesh and takes on the full human experience on our behalf. But where we have failed, He triumphs. In other words, where you and I have messed up, done these stupid things, offended people, hurt ourselves, hurt others, etc., Jesus did not live that way. But He didn't live that way to say, look how great I'm living. Now you got to try to do as good as I did. Which is, I think, what a lot of people think Christianity is Jesus is so good and we got to work hard to try to be as good as Jesus. That's not the point. The point is, you can't be as good as Jesus, so Jesus is good on your behalf. But Jesus experienced rejection from His own town, His own family, ultimately abandonment by His friends, denial of one of His best friends, Peter, betrayal, humiliation, false trial and false accusation, and death. And He didn't do so begrudgingly, He did so willingly, as God Himself, that He might save many. Jesus, God Himself, put Himself into an extremely unpleasant, disadvantaged position for the sake of others. God adapted Himself and didn't become a human being sort of floating above the air with His eyes rolled back white, with a halo over it. No, He became a Jewish man in the first century. In other words, with the customs of what it meant, and the lifestyle of what it meant, and the behavior patterns of what it meant. In other words, He adapted, as it were, right? He contextualized. He didn't live as a Greek or as a Roman. He lived as a Jew. He refrained from eating pork. He was under the law. That you and I might be reconciled to Him and might know a love and a security, a joy that we could never know any other way, a purpose, that we would have eternal life with Him. And Paul sees Jesus and says, I can't be Jesus exactly, obviously. I can't die on the cross for the sins of the world, but I will imitate the pattern of His lifestyle, which means that when I go into a city and I see Jews, even though I know that I'm free to eat pork, I'm free to not follow the Sabbath laws, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. I'm going to put myself at a disadvantage. That might open up opportunities to speak the gospel to my Jewish countrymen, as it were. But then, even though I'm sort of used to this Jewish lifestyle because I grew up as a Jew, Paul was a Pharisee, a Jew of Jews, right? If I get invited over to this house where the Gentiles are and they serve me pork, I don't like pork, I'm not used to eating pork, but I'll eat pork. Because I don't seek my advantage. I seek their advantage. As Jesus didn't seek His advantage, He sought my advantage. And then Paul says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. Corinthians, imitate me as I imitate Christ. Cornerstonians, or something like that. Let's imitate Paul as he imitated Christ. So some of what we have done, some of it has to do with that. It's what are we going to be about? What is our life going to prioritize? What are the values and the basis upon which we do what we do together as a community? Is it about what I want? Or is it about the advantage of others, that they might meet the God who disadvantaged Himself, even unto a cross, even unto the death of a cross, for the salvation of many? And that's the pattern that Paul establishes. So what could this mean for us? We're sort of experiencing it now. This changes, these awkwardness, the discomfort maybe. But I'm encouraged. I'm encouraged because Yesterday, I saw so many of you here. No grumbling, no complaining, so happy to be here, so willing to help, jokes and joy and hard work. And that's encouraging to me. That's a sign that this is already happening in our midst. Okay, so I'm not here to tell you how poorly we're doing. I'm just here to say from the Bible, let's keep at it. Like this is the way. This is the call. We're not off. This is the blueprint, the roadmap that Paul set for us, because ultimately it's the roadmap that Jesus himself set for us. And I really believe, I don't know what it's going to look like, I don't know the specifics, I'm not a prophet or a son of a prophet, as Amos said, but I really believe that as we seek to honor Jesus Christ in these ways and more, there will be more, that we will have to seek and continue to do, that we will see the work of Jesus Christ increase in our lives, in our midst, and through us into the community. So let's keep going and working on this together. Let's pray.